I thought I had built a home that would last forever. The villa was more than walls and windows. It carried the laughter of my children, the struggles of my youth, and the quiet pride of sacrifices no one else could see. But lately, when I walk through its rooms, I feel like an unwelcome guest in my own story. Tell me honestly, have you ever been made to feel small in a place you once gave everything to build? It began with whispers, little comments that slipped between meals. My son's wife would smile, but her words carried edges. Elders should live small, she said, as though my presence in that house was too large, too heavy, too inconvenient. My son said nothing. His silence hurt more than her words. That night, I looked around the villa one last time and realized the truth. It was not me who had grown too big for the house. It was they who had grown too small for gratitude. I didn't sleep well that night. The words rattled in my head long after everyone had gone quiet. Elders should live small. It echoed like a bell, not because of the cruelty in it, but because it was said so easily, as if my life, my years, my home were just clutter to be cleared away. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the photographs on the wall. My son as a boy, his hair messy after school, holding the cricket bat I worked overtime to buy him. My daughter, her graduation day smile, her arm looped through mine. For a moment, I let those pictures speak louder than her words. But when the house went silent, the villa itself felt heavier than ever. I walked the halls slowly, touching the frames, the railings, the walls that had taken decades of repairs and repainting. My hand traced the groove in the doorframe where my children's heights had been marked with pencil. I had kept them all, every uneven line, even when they begged me to paint over them. The house had carried their history. The question now was whether they carried mine. I lingered in the kitchen longer than I should have. The refrigerator hummed faintly, a sound I had known for years. I remembered the night I bought it, pushing it home on the back of a borrowed truck, proud that my family would never have to keep milk in ice trays again. Standing there, I realized how little anyone remembered the effort behind each appliance, each piece of furniture. For them, it was simply stuff. For me, it was years. I thought about my daughter-in-law again. Maybe she had grown up differently, without the same hunger to have a home of her own. Maybe to her, a house was just a box, a temporary place to be swapped when something shinier came along. But for me, the villa had been a promise, not just to myself but to the family I raised. I didn't want to resent her, but her words kept tightening around my chest. The silence in my son's eyes hurt more. When he said nothing, when he let her comment hang in the air without so much as a cough of disagreement, I felt my heart close a little. It wasn't the first time, either. I could remember other moments when his silence had been sharper than any accusation. Like the day I asked him to spend a Sunday fixing the fence with me, and he said he was too busy. Then I saw his car leave an hour later. Like when he told me the villa was too much to manage and suggested I downsize. Downsizing. A word dressed in kindness but rooted in rejection. I walked into the living room, where the largest window overlooked the garden I had tended for years. It was dark outside, but the moonlight revealed the curve of the old mango tree. I remembered planting it when my son was small. He had watered it with his tiny hands, asking how long it would take to bear fruit. Patience, I told him, and care. The tree was taller than the villa now. I wondered if he even remembered planting it. The longer I stared, the more I realized the villa wasn't a refuge anymore. It was a cage filled with echoes of people who didn't see it the way I did. I could almost hear my daughter-in-law's voice whispering again. Elders should live small. Maybe she thought she was being practical. Maybe she believed she was doing me a favor by pushing me toward something easier. But I knew in that moment that it wasn't about ease. It was about dignity. I returned to my bedroom, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I kept thinking of choices I had made decades ago. The night shifts, the weekends lost, the times I said no to myself so I could say yes to my children. I asked myself, was the villa a gift or a burden? Did my son feel gratitude? Or did he see it as a reminder that he had yet to build something of his own? Those questions circled my mind until dawn. When the sun rose, I made tea and sat by the window. The early light touched the walls gently, as if it knew the house was weary, too. I thought about the years I had left, not just to live but to live with dignity. Did I want to spend them walking through rooms that had grown cold with indifference? Did I want to carry the weight of a house that no one wanted to inherit except as a convenience? Or did I want to free myself from its walls and show them that small doesn't mean less? I took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to imagine a life outside the villa. It was terrifying but also strangely freeing. I thought maybe the silence around her words would fade, that I'd wake up and treat it like nothing more than an offhand remark. But silence has a way of growing louder the longer it lingers. At breakfast the next morning, I watched the two of them move around the table, speaking about trivial things. They avoided my eyes, as though what had been said the night before had dissolved into thin air. But for me it was still hanging above us, sharp and heavy, waiting to cut again. She poured herself coffee and, without hesitation, spoke about how much space the villa wasted. "We hardly use half the rooms," she said casually, stirring sugar. "It's too much to keep clean. A smaller place makes more sense." She didn't look at me when she said it. She looked at my son. His face stayed neutral, but the way his jaw tightened told me he agreed, or at least didn't disagree. I set my spoon down gently. My voice didn't rise, but inside, my chest burned. "This house has held us together for decades," I said quietly. "It isn't wasted." Neither of them answered. My son busied himself with his plate. She tapped her nails against the mug, like the subject was closed. I didn't push further. I learned long ago that sometimes silence reveals more than words. But my mind wouldn't let go. I started replaying smaller moments I had brushed aside before. The time she insisted we eat in the smaller dining room instead of the large one because it felt cozier. The time she mentioned how modern apartments are easier to manage. Each phrase had been a seed, and now I saw the pattern clearly. That evening, I sat in the garden with my tea. The mango tree cast long shadows in the fading light. My son came out briefly, phone in hand, scrolling while standing near me. I asked if he remembered planting the tree. He smiled faintly, said, vaguely, and went back to his messages. My heart sank. What I saw as a lifetime of care, he saw as background. Later, I overheard them talking in the living room when they thought I'd gone to bed. She spoke freely now, her voice sharper than when I was in the room. "It's not healthy for him to stay here alone in such a big place. We'd be better off if he sold it and moved somewhere smaller. He'd thank us in the long run." My son muttered something I couldn't catch, then added, "Maybe you're right." That sentence struck me harder than I expected. Maybe you're right. It wasn't just her thought anymore, it was his, too. I lay awake in the dark, the villa suddenly feeling foreign, as if my presence inside it was being debated in another room. It wasn't about comfort or health, I realized. It was about control. Who decides where I belong? Who measures how much space I deserve? The next morning, I moved differently through the villa. I wasn't just walking its halls. I was testing myself. Could I leave it? Could I give up these walls that carried every stage of my life? I studied each room carefully, as though already preparing to say goodbye. But I didn't announce anything. Not yet. I wanted them to think I was still clinging to the past, still holding on stubbornly. I wanted to see how far their words would go, how sharp their reasoning could become when they thought I had no choice but to listen. And sure enough, it came again. Over dinner, my daughter-in-law brought up a neighbor who had downsized into an apartment. She praised how happy they seemed, how simple their life had become. She spoke as though the idea was obvious, as though I should thank her for pointing it out. I glanced at my son. He nodded slightly, not in agreement, but in avoidance, as if he wanted to move past the topic quickly. But silence is its own kind of agreement, and I knew it. Inside me, a new thought took root. If they wanted me small, I would show them what small could look like, not as a loss but as a choice. The villa didn't define my strength. I did. And if they believed I would shrink into the corner they prepared for me, they didn't know me at all. When I think back to how this house even came to be ours, I can't help but laugh a little at the irony. They talk now as if it's just too much space, too much to handle. But when I first set my eyes on this villa, it wasn't space I saw. It was possibility. It was the proof that everything I had worked for wasn't slipping through my fingers. I still remember the day I signed the papers. My hands were shaking so badly that the pen nearly slipped. It wasn't nerves, it was disbelief. I had come from a one-room rental where 4 of us slept side by side, where every crack in the wall let in wind during winter nights. Moving into a house with more than one bedroom felt like stepping into a new life. My wife held the keys so tightly her knuckles turned pale. She kept repeating, "This is ours?" as though saying it out loud would keep it from being taken away. The truth is, it didn't come easily. I worked double shifts for years. I remember stumbling home late at night, smelling of sweat and grease, sometimes too tired to even eat. On Sundays, when most men rested, I was finding small side jobs, fixing engines, painting walls, even unloading goods for a shopkeeper who barely paid. Every coin was counted and stretched, and whenever I felt like quitting, I would picture the day my children would have rooms of their own. That image kept me moving forward. It wasn't just money I gave up. I let go of weekends with friends, hobbies I once enjoyed, even the chance to take short holidays. We didn't travel when the children were young. Every time they asked why, I'd tell them, "One day, you'll understand." And I hoped they would. I hoped they'd see the sacrifices not as chains, but as a ladder I built for them to climb higher. That's what makes her comment cut so deep. To dismiss the villa as too much, as if it were an unnecessary ornament, felt like erasing all of those years. To her, it was square footage. To me, it was decades of sweat turned into walls and windows. I can still picture my son running down the hallway, chasing his sister with a toy airplane. My wife yelling at them not to knock over the vase, which of course they did. Or the countless birthday parties where balloons hung unevenly because I never could tie them right. The villa held our lives in its corners. Every crack in the paint had a story. Now, sitting across the table from them, I wondered, do they even remember any of this? Or is memory something that fades when convenience takes over? I think about my wife often in moments like this. She's been gone for years now, but if she were here, she wouldn't have stayed quiet. She had a way of defending what mattered with just a look, a firmness that silenced even the boldest remarks. I sometimes imagine her voice, telling our son, "This is your father's house. You show respect." But imagining only goes so far. In reality, it was just me, sitting there in silence, swallowing the bitterness. Maybe that's why I started reflecting so much that week. I'd walk through the villa and see not just the walls, but the man I used to be. I'd ask myself, what was all of it for? Was it to hand my children comfort? Was it to shield them from the kind of hardship I knew as a boy? If so, then maybe I succeeded. Maybe they grew too comfortable. Comfortable enough to believe the effort didn't matter anymore. One evening, I found myself in the storage room, opening boxes I hadn't touched in years. Old receipts, broken toys, notebooks filled with numbers from when I was calculating every last rupee. I sat there for hours, going through those scraps like an archaeologist uncovering proof of a life once lived. It wasn't sadness I felt, it was clarity. These things told the truth of my sacrifices, even if no one else cared to remember. I thought about showing my son those old records. I imagined putting the boxes in front of him and asking, "Do you see now what this house cost me?" But then I stopped myself. If he couldn't already feel it when he walked these halls, numbers wouldn't change his heart. The more I reflected, the more one thought kept coming back. Maybe it was time to stop holding on so tightly. Maybe the villa wasn't a symbol anymore. Maybe it was just a reminder that I was living among people who couldn't see its value. And what is a house, really, if the people inside it strip it of meaning? That realization didn't settle all at once. Came in waves. One moment, I'd be convincing myself to endure, to stay, to ignore the words that stung. The next moment, I'd picture myself stepping into something new. Not because I was forced, but because I chose. The thought scared me, but it also gave me a strange kind of strength. I told myself I wouldn't decide too quickly. But deep down, I think the decision was already made. When I finally decided what I had to do, I didn't announce it right away. Some choices are too heavy to throw into a room like a stone through glass. They need to sit quietly in your chest until the right moment forces them out. That's what this felt like. A truth too sharp to speak without cutting everything around it. For a week, I moved through the villa as though nothing had changed. My son and his wife spoke the way they always did, casually, almost carelessly. But inside I was watching every word, every look, every time they mentioned space as though it were a burden. Each comment only confirmed what I had already come to accept. This house meant nothing to them. Late at night, I would sit alone in the living room, the old clock ticking on the wall. I'd trace the outlines of the furniture with my eyes, remembering where each piece had come from. The dining table where we once gathered for meals. The sofa that still carried the faint imprint of my wife's favorite seat. I asked myself, if the people in this house no longer carry its meaning, why am I the only one still holding on? That question wouldn't leave me. It grew louder each day, until one morning I stood up, got dressed, and walked to the notary's office. The air felt heavy, like I was carrying years of history on my back. I wasn't selling just a property. I was closing the door on a part of my life. But as I signed the first papers, a strange calm settled in. It wasn't regret. It was relief. Of course, they didn't know yet. I kept the decision close, waiting. I wanted them to face it not as an argument, but as a reality they couldn't dismiss. For too long, my words had been treated like background noise. But a stamped contract? That couldn't be ignored. The day I told them started like any other. My son was reading the newspaper, his wife scrolling on her phone. They didn't notice the envelope I placed on the table until I pushed it toward them. "What's this?" my son asked. "Open it," I said. He tore it open carelessly, skimming the document. His eyes narrowed, his lips parted, but no words came out at first. His wife leaned over his shoulder, and then her voice filled the silence. "You're selling the villa?" she said, almost in disbelief. "Yes," I answered simply. My son finally spoke, his tone sharper than I'd heard in years. "You didn't even ask us?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Did you ask me when you dismissed the life built here? When you said it was too much? When you treated this house as if it were just walls and space?" He didn't respond. He just stared at me, caught between anger and confusion. His wife tried to step in. "But where will we go? What about the children?" I leaned back in my chair. "That's for you to decide. I've carried this home long enough. Now it's time you learn what it means to stand on your own." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. I could see the weight of it sinking in. For the first time, they realized that my patience had run out. The truth is, I wasn't trying to punish them. I wasn't looking for revenge. I just wanted my dignity back. And sometimes, dignity doesn't come from holding on, it comes from letting go. In the days that followed, the atmosphere shifted completely. My son stopped making casual remarks about the house. His wife, usually so confident, avoided meeting my eyes. The villa no longer felt like a burden in their voices. Now it was something slipping away, something they couldn't control. I spent those days packing slowly, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted time to breathe through each memory. Every room I emptied felt lighter. The villa was no longer binding me. It was releasing me. When the buyers finally came to inspect the place, I walked them through quietly, pointing out details only I would know. "This door sticks a little in winter," I said. "The sun hits this corner best in the mornings." I wasn't just selling a house. I was passing on a story, one that my own family no longer wanted to hear. By the time the sale went through, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt steady. My son and his wife looked at me differently after that. Maybe they saw strength where they once saw weakness. Or maybe they just saw the reality that their words had consequences. Either way, I no longer carried the weight of needing their recognition. I had made my choice. And in that choice, I had reclaimed myself. I often wonder if they expected me to falter after leaving the villa behind. Maybe they thought I would shrink into some corner of rented space, quietly fading away. But the truth was different. Letting go of that house gave me something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. For once, my choices weren't shaped by their remarks or their silence. They were shaped by me. The first morning in the penthouse, I woke up to light pouring in from windows so wide I could see half the city. The air was sharp and fresh, and I stood there for a long time just breathing, the way a man does when he finally understands freedom. It wasn't just a new home. It was proof that I didn't need anyone's approval to live with dignity. Still, the echoes of what happened at the villa lingered. There were moments, quiet evenings especially, when I thought about the way my son looked at me that day, stunned that I would act without his consent. A small part of me wanted to ask him, "When did you begin believing my life belonged to you?" But I never asked. Some questions are better left unspoken, their answers already too clear. In time, word spread through the family. Relatives called, some shocked, some curious, some quietly admiring. They all asked in their own way, "Why did you do it?" My answer was always the same. Because a man who gives everything deserves the right to decide when enough has been taken from him. Weeks passed. Then came the moment I never expected. My son called, his voice cautious. Their lease had ended, and they were struggling to find another place. Prices were high, landlords unyielding. "We need somewhere to stay," he finally admitted. I listened, saying nothing at first. His wife's voice floated faintly in the background, urging him to press harder. He asked if I could help. Not by lending money, not by speaking to someone, but by offering space. And here was the irony. The same people who said elders should live small were now asking to live under my roof. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence hang there, the same way they had let my presence in the villa shrink into a burden. Finally, I said, "I have space, but if you come here, it will not be as before. You will live on my terms, and you will respect what you once dismissed." They agreed, of course. Desperation leaves little room for pride. The day they moved in, I watched them carry boxes into a place they never thought they'd need. My son avoided my eyes at first, but eventually he looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years. Humility. His wife, quieter than usual, seemed to understand that words carry weight, and sometimes that weight returns heavier than expected. Now, each month they hand me rent, not out of cruelty on my part, but as a simple truth. This is my home, and in this home, dignity is not negotiable. Every time I collect it, I don't feel vengeance. I feel balance. I tell this story not because I seek pity or applause, but because too many of us, especially as we age, begin to believe that our worth is measured by how much space we take up in the lives of others. The truth is, our worth is measured by the strength with which we defend our place in our own lives. I've learned that silence can be powerful, but action speaks louder. By selling the villa, I didn't just walk away from a house. I walked away from being treated as an afterthought. And in doing so, I found a new chapter that belongs only to me. So if you ever find yourself in the position where your presence is treated like a burden, remember this. You are not bound to remain where you are not valued. You can choose differently, and sometimes, choosing differently is the only way to teach others what respect truly means. As for me, I wake up each morning, look out at the skyline, and know that I've reclaimed what matters most. Not a house, not even family harmony, but self-respect. And with that, I finally feel at peace. People talk. They always have, and they always will. The day word got out that I had sold the villa and bought a penthouse, neighbors and relatives treated it like breaking news. Some said I was reckless. Others whispered that I was clever. But nearly all of them wanted to know what really happened behind those closed doors. I didn't go around telling everyone my son's wife had told me elders should live small. That was private. But stories have a way of leaking out, sometimes louder than the truth itself. By the time it reached distant cousins, the tale had turned into something like a scandal. "He threw them out," they said. Or, "He cut them off entirely." People like exaggeration. They thrive on it. When an old friend came to visit me at the penthouse, he asked directly, "Did you really abandon your family?" I laughed at that. "Abandon?" I repeated. "I left a house, not my son. There's a difference." He nodded slowly, and after that, the gossip didn't matter much to me. I realized people will believe what fits their own fears. But the real test came during gatherings. Weddings, funerals, casual dinners, you can't avoid family in those places. Some approached me with admiration, quietly saying I had done what they themselves wished they had the courage to do. Others looked at me with suspicion, like I had broken some unspoken rule about age and obedience. My son and his wife sat in uncomfortable silence when these conversations came up. I could tell she hated that people were now looking at her differently. Where once she walked around confident, she now carried herself cautiously. And in that silence between us, there was something unspoken. She knew her words had reshaped everything, not just my living arrangement. What surprised me most was the younger generation, nephews, nieces, even grandchildren. Some of them started calling me directly, asking how I managed it. "Wasn't it hard to let go of the house?" one nephew asked. I told him the truth. Harder to let go of your dignity than a house. Once you understand that, the decision isn't hard at all. And maybe that was the turning point for me. I realized this story was no longer just about me, my son, or his wife. It had become a lesson carried across the family. People began looking at their own lives, their own compromises. Some even admitted they envied me, not for the penthouse but for the freedom. Of course, not everyone celebrated. There were whispers that I was selfish, that I should have stayed put, that family harmony was more important than personal pride. But harmony built on silence isn't harmony. The suffocation. I learned that long ago, though it took me years to act on it. I noticed small changes in my son. He didn't argue as much. He came to me for advice carefully, as though relearning how to speak to me as a father rather than as a burden. He even asked about my health, something he had stopped doing when his wife's voice was louder than mine. Those little things told me he was beginning to understand. But his wife, she remained distant, sometimes polite, never warm. I could see the struggle in her. Living here under my roof meant facing the reality she had tried to dismiss. That I wasn't shrinking, I was expanding. And every rent payment was a reminder of that shift. Late at night, sitting by the window, I'd think about how life had turned. A single remark, "Elders should live small," had sparked a chain of choices that changed everything. And I wondered, how many of us carry those words in silence, shrinking into corners we don't deserve? How many never push back? The truth is, I didn't just change my living space. I changed the way my family looks at me, the way they measure my place in their lives. And though it wasn't easy, though the road was filled with whispers, criticism, and strained dinners, I wouldn't undo it. I think back to the villa sometimes. The echo of footsteps in hallways that once felt too large for me alone. But here, in this high rise, with the city spread out like a canvas, I feel lighter. Not because it's perfect, but because it's mine. My choice, my space, my dignity. And maybe that's all I ever wanted. Not control, not revenge. Just the simple right to live without apology. At first, I thought things would settle into a routine. They paid their rent, I lived my life, and we shared the same roof without much fuss. But harmony built on silence rarely lasts. Beneath the surface, I began to sense something shifting, subtle at first, then louder in ways you can't mistake. It started with small remarks. My son's wife would comment on the penthouse being temporary, as if she believed it wasn't really mine to keep. Or she'd mention that high-rise living wasn't family-friendly. Her tone sharpened just enough to suggest she was planting ideas in my son's mind. He never corrected her, but his silence carried weight. I told myself not to overthink it. But late at night, when I heard whispers behind their door, I couldn't shake the unease. They spoke softly, yet the rhythm of their voices gave them away. Planning, debating, disagreeing. The walls may be thick, but the air inside a home always carries tension. One evening, my son sat with me at the dining table, avoiding my eyes. He asked about the paperwork for the penthouse. Did I register it in my name alone? Was there any backup plan in case I couldn't manage? His questions were framed as concern, but I recognized the undertone. They weren't just questions. They were feelers probing for weaknesses. I answered calmly, "This place is mine." Clear and simple. No banks, no debts, no cosigners. Why do you ask? He stumbled over his reply, muttering something about security and planning for the future. But the way his wife entered the room just then, her face unreadable, told me more than his words ever could. That night I barely slept. My thoughts circled the same point. Were they trying to wait me out, or were they already searching for ways to edge me out? I didn't want to believe my own son could be led into such schemes, but I had seen enough in life to know family loyalty bends easily under pressure. The tension grew. She began making subtle changes, rearranging things in the common spaces without asking, acting as if she were managing the household. Once, she even corrected me about where I placed the mail, laughing as though it were a joke. But behind that laugh was something sharper. I realized then this wasn't about living arrangements anymore. It was about control. She couldn't stand that the ground she stood on belonged to me, that each month she had to hand me rent like a tenant instead of walking freely as though the place were hers. The atmosphere thickened. Meals grew quieter, conversations shorter. My son looked torn, caught between defending his wife and facing the truth of my resolve. And me? I waited, listening, observing, biding my time, because when people feel cornered, their next move always reveals more than they intended. There was one night I'll never forget. I walked into the living room and saw her quickly close her laptop. The way she snapped it shut, the way she glanced at me, it wasn't casual. She was hiding something. I didn't ask then. Instead, I sat down and watched the city lights through the window. But inside, I felt the cold certainty of what was coming. Something was being planned, and sooner or later I would be forced to confront it. When the air inside my own home began to feel heavier, I found myself drifting back to earlier years. Sometimes, to understand the shape of what's unfolding in front of you, you have to measure it against where you started. The betrayal stung sharper because of the weight of what I'd once carried for him. I remembered working double shifts when he was in school. Back then, I thought nothing of missing meals or walking home late, too tired to even untie my shoes before falling into bed. My only thought was to give him more than I had growing up. Every saved rupee, every late night, every ignored ache. It was all so he could stand on ground more solid than the one I'd known. There were mornings I'd leave before the sun rose, quietly closing the door so he wouldn't wake. And evenings when he'd be asleep by the time I returned, school books scattered beside him, his small chest rising and falling. I told myself that one day, he'd look back and see those sacrifices not as distance, but as proof that I was building a foundation beneath him. Those memories returned uninvited, sharp against the quiet tension of the penthouse. Now I watched him walk past me with eyes that rarely lingered. I thought of the times I'd gone without so he could have new shoes, or the nights I'd mended his uniform under the faint light in our old house. He had once clung to me with a trust so complete it left no space for doubt. It was strange, seeing that boy transformed into a man whose loyalty now tilted elsewhere. I wondered when the shift began. Was it gradual, hidden under years of small choices, or had it come swiftly, wrapped in the influence of the woman he chose to marry? Reflection doesn't give answers, only patterns. And the pattern I saw was distance growing where once there had been closeness. The more I thought about the past, the more I recognized why their actions unsettled me so deeply. It wasn't only about property or rent or control of the household. It was about memory clashing with reality. I had imagined that the years of effort I gave him would one day bind us in respect. Instead, I felt as though those years had been brushed aside like dust no one cared to notice. Still, I wasn't blind. I could see the cracks in him too. He wasn't completely at ease with her remarks, nor with the way she assumed authority in spaces she hadn't earned. Sometimes he avoided my gaze as though my presence reminded him of obligations he'd rather not confront. Other times, I caught him hesitating before speaking, as though trapped between two loyalties he couldn't balance. But even hesitation can cut deep. When someone you raised refuses to speak firmly on your side, silence itself feels like a choice. That was the part that gnawed at me. His refusal to set boundaries in a house that bore my name. I carried these thoughts quietly. Outwardly, I maintained calm, going about my routines without complaint. Inwardly, I replayed scenes of the past against the silence of the present. I remembered the day I bought this place, signing papers with a mixture of relief and pride. I had thought, at least here, I'll never be dependent on anyone else. At least here, I'll know stability. Now that very space was becoming a battlefield of unspoken words. The reflective mood sharpened one evening as I sat alone in the living room. The city lights blinked beyond the glass, but my mind wandered to the small, dim apartment where my son once learned to walk. I could see him toddling toward me, arms stretched wide, certain I would catch him. That boy had never doubted me, and I had never doubted him. So how did we arrive here, in a home where I no longer felt free to sit without sensing eyes measuring me? How had trust turned into something so fragile it could break under the weight of a single glance or question? I realized then that betrayal doesn't announce itself with grand gestures at first. It shows up in shifts too small to notice until they've gathered into something undeniable. And now I was staring at it. Not in words spoken outright, but in silences, hesitations, and the growing shadow of her presence in my own house. That night, I told myself something important. If I allowed memories of the past to blind me, I'd miss what was happening in the present. I had to stop looking at him only as the boy I raised and start seeing him as the man standing in front of me, with choices I could no longer control. Reflection offered me clarity, but it also hardened my resolve. I could mourn what had been, yes, but I could not allow that mourning to turn into weakness, because the truth was clear. If I didn't defend what was mine, they would eventually take it from me, whether by persuasion, by manipulation, or by silence stretched long enough to feel like consent. You've probably had that moment when silence stops being an option. I tried to keep things steady, tried to overlook the remarks, the little digs, the shifting tone of my own son. But one evening, the weight of it all pressed down too hard, and the words came out before I could stop them. It started over something simple. Dinner. I'd sat at the table, the same table I'd chosen years back, remembering how my son once sat there scribbling on napkins, telling me about school projects. That night, though, I wasn't a father at the head of his table. I was a guest in my own home, waiting while she placed plates without even looking at me. She set one in front of him, another for herself, then finally slid mine across as though it were an afterthought. I don't know if you've ever felt that, the small sting of being treated like you're not part of the circle anymore. It doesn't seem like much from the outside, but when it's repeated, it eats at you. And in that moment, the sting was too sharp to swallow. I asked her, straight out, "Do you forget whose house you're eating in?" The words dropped heavy. My son froze. She didn't blink. Instead, she gave that smile I'd seen too many times. The one that carried no warmth, just a trace of amusement at my expense. "This isn't just your house anymore," she said, calm, steady, not even raising her voice. "It's our home now. Things change." I turned to him, waiting for him to correct her, to remind her whose name sat on the deed. He didn't. He lowered his eyes and cut into his food, as if hiding behind silence could erase the tension. That silence hit me harder than her words. So I pressed. "Our home," I asked. "Did you pay for the roof above your head? Did you sign for these walls? Or did you walk in and decide ownership came with a marriage certificate?" For a second, I thought my son would speak up. His fork hovered, his lips parted, but nothing came out. That quiet told me everything. He wasn't going to defend me. He wasn't going to defend what was right. She leaned back, studying me as if she'd won some small battle. "I'm not arguing about paperwork. I'm talking about reality. He and I live here together. If you don't like the way things are, maybe you should consider other arrangements." That sentence cut sharper than I expected. Other arrangements. Imagine hearing that in the home you built, the place you poured your years into, the place you thought you'd end your days in peace. I wish I could tell you I stayed calm, that I had some clever reply lined up. But no, the anger rose too fast, too deep. I slammed my hand against the table, not out of habit, but because it was the only way to stop myself from shouting. The dishes rattled, and for the first time, my son looked at me directly. "Don't talk to her like that," he said quietly. Not loud, not forceful, but enough. Enough to show me which side he'd chosen in that moment. I leaned back, the fight draining into something colder. It wasn't about a plate or even about her comment. It was about the fact that my own son, the boy I'd once carried on my shoulders, the one I thought would stand beside me through anything, had spoken against me for the sake of keeping peace with her. That's when I realized the battle wasn't just between her and me. It was inside him. And if I didn't stand firm, I would lose not just ground in my own home, but the last thread of respect binding us. So I did something different. I didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't let rage steer me. I stood up, pushed back my chair, and said, I built this place so you'd never have to worry about where you belong. But if you think my presence here is optional, you've forgotten who made this roof possible. And I won't be made invisible in the house I paid for. Then I walked out of the room, left my plate untouched. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. That night, lying awake, I thought about how quickly things had turned. You can endure small slights for a long time, hoping they'll fade. But once the words are spoken aloud, once someone tells you to consider leaving, there's no pretending anymore. The line has been crossed. And here's the part most people don't understand. The first open clash isn't the worst. It's the confirmation of everything you suspected before. It shows you that your gut was right. The whispers, the glances, the subtle moves weren't just in your head. They were building toward this. So when I finally closed my eyes that night, I wasn't just angry. I was steady. Because now I knew exactly what I was dealing with. And once the truth stands in front of you, clear and undeniable, you stop wasting time with doubt. You start preparing for what comes next. You can ignore whispers. You can even stomach disrespect. But once someone openly tells you that you don't belong in the house you built, the silence after becomes unbearable. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, knowing I couldn't simply drift back into the routine. Something was shifting, and I needed to decide whether I'd be dragged along or take the reins myself. The truth is, I wasn't afraid of being alone. I'd faced that once already after my wife passed. What I feared was the slow erasure of everything I had worked for, the quiet dismantling of my place in a family I had built with my own hands. They wanted me in the shadows, sitting quietly until I faded into a memory. I couldn't let that happen. So the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I pulled the keyring from my drawer and held it in my palm. Those keys weren't just metal and teeth. They represented decades of sacrifice, the mortgage payments, the overtime shifts, the long nights of fixing pipes and repairing cracks so my son never had to wonder if the house would stand. And now I was being told that those years meant nothing. I began searching through the old lockbox in my study. Papers rustled, yellowed with age, but still sharp in their meaning. The deed. My name. No one else's. I held it in my hand like proof against the doubts that had crept in. They might have tried to rewrite the story with words, but the ink on that page told the truth. Still, holding the deed wasn't enough. I needed to make a decision. Would I keep living under the same roof, swallowing bitterness with every meal, or would I draw a line so clear they could never mistake where I stood? That day I moved differently. I watched them both closely, not with anger, but with a sharpened awareness. At breakfast, she slid the plate the same way she always did, without meeting my eyes. He drank his coffee quickly, avoiding conversation. But I didn't react. Not yet. I let them think the night before had passed without consequence. Inside, though, I was planning. I started making small notes, lists of what I owned outright, where the accounts were, who in the family I could still trust if things escalated. It wasn't about revenge, it was about control. If I was going to fight for my dignity, I needed more than pride. I needed preparation. Later that afternoon, I took a quiet walk to the edge of the property. The trees I had planted years back had grown tall now, their roots steady. Looking at them, I realized something important. Roots don't ask for permission to stay. They dig deep. They hold the ground whether others want them or not. I had to be like that. Not waiting for approval, not hoping for gratitude. I had to claim my place. By evening, I felt the weight of the decision pressing harder. My son and his wife sat watching television, laughing softly at a scene I didn't care to follow. For the first time, I noticed how easily I had become background noise in my own house, a figure they no longer acknowledged unless I interrupted. That's when it became clear. It wasn't enough to confront them with words. Words could be twisted, dismissed, forgotten. I needed to show them, in a way that couldn't be argued, that I wasn't a guest here. I was the owner. So I went back to the lockbox, pulled out the deed, and placed it on the table where they couldn't miss it. Not tucked away, not hidden in a drawer. Right there, in the open. I didn't speak, didn't explain. I wanted them to see it for themselves, to know that whatever picture they were trying to paint, the frame still belonged to me. I walked past them without a word, leaving the document where the light hit it. And as I stepped into my room, I could feel the tension building behind me. I knew they had seen it. I knew the silence wasn't going to last much longer. That night, as I lay down again, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not peace, not yet, but a sense of control returning. They had drawn a line by questioning my place. I had drawn one back by reminding them of reality. But even as I closed my eyes, I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the opening move. The real confrontation was still coming. And when it did, there would be no hiding behind smiles or silence. I didn't have to wait long. By the next morning, the silence in the house felt brittle, like something waiting to snap. I poured myself tea, sat at the table, and pretended to read the paper. But I wasn't really looking at the words. I was listening, waiting. I knew eventually one of them would break. It was her voice first. "What's this supposed to mean?" she asked, holding up the deed I had left in the open. Her tone wasn't curious. It was sharp, cutting. She already knew the answer but wanted to force the conflict into the light. I stayed calm. "It means exactly what it says. This house is mine." My son shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the table, as though if he stayed quiet, the argument would pass like a storm moving overhead. But she wasn't going to let it pass. "So this is what you're doing now? Leaving papers around like warnings? Do you think that makes this place yours forever?" I folded the paper and set it aside. "It already is mine. I built this place when you were both still children. Every brick, every wall, every repair. It's my work. I didn't leave that paper to threaten. I left it because I won't be erased in my own home." She laughed under her breath, the kind of laugh that doesn't carry amusement, only disdain. "You're clinging to the past. Things change. Families change. Houses change. You can't keep living like nothing has moved on." That's when I looked at my son. "And what about you? Do you think I should live small? Do you think I don't deserve to stay here?" He finally raised his eyes, and the hesitation in them was worse than any direct answer. "Dad, it's not about what you deserve. It's about what's practical. A villa this size. It's a lot. Maybe she's right. Maybe moving somewhere smaller would be easier for you." Those words struck harder than anything before. Not because of their content, but because of who said them. The silence that followed felt heavy. I realized he had chosen. Not loudly, not angrily, but clearly enough. He had chosen her comfort over my dignity. I leaned back in my chair, steadying myself. Practical for who? For you? For her? Or for me? Because let's be clear. I'm not the one struggling to live here. I know every inch of this house better than you know your own thoughts. He didn't reply. His eyes lowered again, and I saw the boy I once carried on my shoulders. Now a man too afraid to stand upright in front of his own father. That was the breaking point. I stood, walked over to the deed in her hand, and gently took it back. If I'm such a burden, then maybe the answer isn't me living smaller. Maybe the answer is me leaving this house altogether. You two can have all the space you want, without me in it. For the first time, her smile faltered. She hadn't expected that. She wanted me cornered, dependent, compliant. But the idea that I might simply walk away, taking with me the foundation they stood on, unsettled her. She tried to recover quickly. "Where would you even go?" she asked. "That's my decision," I said firmly. What matters is that I won't stay here being treated like I'm in the way. You want it smaller? You'll get it. You'll see how it feels when the walls echo without me. My son opened his mouth as if to protest, but the words never formed. Maybe he realized what he had allowed. Maybe he simply didn't know what to say. I left the room without another word. For the rest of the day, I felt strangely lighter. Not happy, not free, but clear. A line had been drawn, and there was no walking it back. That night, as I lay awake again, I thought about the years I had given, the memories I had stacked in these rooms, the sacrifices I had swallowed quietly so that he could grow without worry. And now, with a few careless words, he had told me those years were too heavy to bear. But in that reflection, I also saw something else. If they wanted me gone, then maybe it was time to leave, but not in shame. I could leave on my own terms, with my head high. The villa wasn't a prison. It was proof that I had already built something once. And maybe, just maybe, I could build again. I thought their silence would give me peace, but instead, it left me with questions I couldn't ignore. Walking out of that room had drawn a line, yes, but it hadn't erased the years of living under the same roof. I sat alone that night, staring at the walls, and wondered what it would mean to truly let go of this place. The house wasn't just wood and plaster. It was every story, every gathering, every fight and reconciliation, every birthday where laughter spilled into the halls. Could I really walk away from all of it? But then I remembered my son's words. Maybe smaller would be easier. He hadn't said it out of care. He had said it as a way to make me shrink. And once I replayed that, the choice didn't feel so heavy anymore. It wasn't about losing the villa. It was about gaining myself back. The next morning, I made my first call to an estate agent. He didn't know who I was, just another voice on the line asking about options. He asked me questions about the property, the size, the location. I answered calmly, each detail carrying the weight of my history. When I hung up, I didn't feel regret. I felt a strange steadiness, as if finally putting my hand back on the wheel of my own life. Over the next few days, I began moving through the rooms differently. I didn't see them as sacred anymore. I saw them as assets, rooms that could hold value for someone else. I walked slowly, checking the walls, windows, the garden out front. Everything I once tied to memory, I now measured with distance. I knew this shift had to happen, or else I would never be able to go through with it. They noticed the change in me. My daughter-in-law eyed me suspiciously when she saw me speaking to the gardener about trimming the front hedge. My son asked if I needed help when I took out some old files and began sorting them. I didn't give them answers. I just kept going, steady, deliberate, unshaken. What I didn't tell them was that I had also asked the agent to show me alternatives. If I was going to leave this house, I wasn't going to a corner flat tucked away like a punishment. I wanted something that reflected the years I had worked for, something that proved I hadn't been diminished by their treatment. I wanted light, space, and freedom. The first property the agent showed me was decent enough. Quiet neighborhood, tidy layout. But when I walked through it, I felt nothing. It was clean but ordinary. I imagined myself there, sitting at the table, looking out the window, and I couldn't picture peace. I could only picture compromise. I didn't leave my own home just to compromise again. The second place was worse. Narrow, cramped, walls so close they made me feel as if the air itself was rationed. No, if I was leaving behind the villa, it had to be for something more. It was the third place that stopped me. A penthouse, high above the noise, with glass walls that opened to the city below. The moment I stepped inside, I felt my lungs expand. The rooms weren't filled with memories of old fights. They weren't haunted by unspoken resentments. They were open, waiting. And for the first time in years, I imagined myself not as a burden, but as a man who had chosen something for himself. The agent noticed the way I stood by the window, quiet, thoughtful. "Do you like it?" he asked. "I do," I said, and I meant it. But liking it wasn't enough. I had to decide. I had to make the kind of decision that would send a message, not just to them, but to myself. That night, back in the villa, I sat with the papers spread out in front of me. One pile held the valuation of the house I had lived in for decades. The other held the documents for the penthouse. Both were choices. Both were futures. I looked at them, then at the silence of the rooms around me, and finally I understood. Leaving wasn't surrender. Leaving was reclaiming. I picked up the pen and signed the papers that would begin the sale of the villa. My hand didn't tremble. My heart didn't falter. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath that seemed to carry years of waiting. They wouldn't understand, not at first. They would call it rash, dramatic, unnecessary. But I knew the truth. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, and the life I still had left to live. The villa had been my proof of endurance. The penthouse would be my proof of choice. And for once, I was choosing myself. When the papers were signed, I thought I would feel finished. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a storm. The villa was no longer mine to protect, but theirs to understand. And I knew the moment they discovered the truth, there would be no calm conversation. They had spent years assuming I was stuck, that the house bound me the way a cage binds a bird. They never thought I would have the courage to walk away and leave them staring at their own reflection in the emptiness. I didn't announce the sale. I didn't owe them that courtesy. But word travels fast in a house where everyone thinks they're entitled to know your business. My daughter-in-law was the first to stumble across the truth. I heard her voice before I saw her face. Sharp, clipped, rushing down the hall. "What is this?" she shouted, waving the letter she must have found on the counter. I looked at her and said nothing. She shook the paper at me as though it were a weapon. "You're selling the villa? Without telling us?" There it was, the entitlement. She wasn't asking why. She was demanding permission. My son came in soon after, slower, his eyes darting between us. He took the paper from her hand, scanned it quickly, then looked at me as if I had betrayed him. "You can't just decide something like this," he said. I leaned back in my chair and studied his face. "I can, and I already did." The silence that followed was heavy. I could see them both searching for the right angle to attack. Would it be guilt? Would it be anger? Would it be the tired performance of caring about my well-being while really caring about their own comfort? It was my daughter-in-law who struck first. "Where are we supposed to go? This is our home too." "No," I said firmly. "It was never your home. You lived here because I allowed it. Don't twist that into ownership." Her mouth dropped, and for the first time, she didn't have a reply ready. My son, though, tried a different tactic. "You're making a mistake. This place, it's your life's work. Everything you built is here." "Everything I built," I corrected. "Not everything I am." He looked at me as though I had spoken in another language. That was the problem. I had spent years letting them believe the house defined me. Now they couldn't imagine me without it, even though I could. The days that followed were a battle of silence and slamming doors. They moved through the villa like squatters caught off guard, whispering behind closed doors, making phone calls I could hear but not quite decipher. Once, I caught a piece of a sentence from my daughter-in-law. "He can't just throw us out like this. There must be a way to challenge it." I almost laughed. They could challenge all they wanted. The signatures were ink on paper now, and no tantrum could erase them. But I wasn't naive. I knew their resentment wouldn't stop at words. They began to act differently. Small acts, petty gestures. My son forgot to pick up groceries when it was his turn. My daughter-in-law moved my things around in the kitchen, as if rearranging the shelves could reclaim the space. It didn't matter. Each act of defiance only reminded me that my choice had been right. Meanwhile, I visited the penthouse again, alone this time. Standing in those open rooms, with sunlight spilling in from wide windows, I felt like I could finally breathe. The city stretched out below me, and I imagined living there without the constant noise of entitlement in the next room. Felt like more than a place. It felt like a decision that had no regrets attached. When I returned to the villa, the tension had sharpened. They wanted answers I wouldn't give. My daughter-in-law cornered me in the hall one evening, her voice low, almost hissing. "Do you have any idea what this will do to us? Where do you expect us to go?" "That's not my problem to solve." She recoiled as if I had struck her. For years I had been the one to patch, to fix, to smooth over. Now, for the first time, I was letting the consequences rest where they belonged. The night before the estate agent scheduled the first showing, I sat alone in the living room. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. I knew they were in their room, plotting, whispering, perhaps even preparing for some desperate move to stall the sale. And yet, I felt steady. For once, I wasn't the one afraid of what came next. When the day arrived, the agent arrived with a polite knock. Behind him came potential buyers, strangers who walked through the villa with detached curiosity, pointing at walls, asking about square footage. My son stood off to the side, arms crossed, jaw tight. My daughter-in-law didn't even try to hide her disdain. She muttered under her breath as they passed, calling them vultures. But I stood by the window, hands in my pockets, and let it all happen. The villa wasn't a shrine anymore. It was a property, and it was leaving my hands. Later, when the buyers left, my son confronted me again. "You're destroying everything. Do you even care what this does to our family?" I turned slowly and met his eyes. What destroyed this family wasn't the sale. It was the way you treated me long before this. He opened his mouth to argue but stopped. For once, he had nothing to say, and that silence was louder than any outburst. The moment the contract moved forward, I thought the fight would quiet down, but it only shifted into something more desperate. My son and his wife realized they couldn't stop the sale legally, so they tried to sabotage it in ways I hadn't anticipated. That week felt like walking through a house with hidden traps, never knowing where the next one might spring. The first attempt came when the agent scheduled a follow-up tour with serious buyers. I had stepped out for an errand, and when I returned, I found the living room in disarray. Curtains pulled half down, cushions slashed open, and a broken vase scattered across the floor. My daughter-in-law stood in the doorway, arms crossed, daring me to accuse her. "Do you really think anyone will buy a place that looks like this?" she said flatly. I didn't give her the argument she wanted. Instead, I picked up the shards, one piece at a time, and let the silence sit heavy between us. The buyers still came the next day, and the agent smoothed over the damage with practiced ease. What they didn't realize was that the sabotage didn't weaken my resolve. It hardened it. The second attempt was subtler. My son began hinting to the agent that I wasn't of sound mind, sprinkling small seeds of doubt in conversations when he thought I wasn't listening. "He forgets things," I overheard him say one afternoon. "Sometimes he doesn't even remember what day it is." I waited until the agent left before I addressed him. "Do you think making me sound incompetent will stop this?" He looked away, his jaw tightening. "I'm trying to protect you." "Protect me?" I repeated slowly. "By lying about me?" The words hung in the air. He didn't answer, and that silence told me enough. Still, the third attempt was the one that stung. They tried to play the role of the dutiful children at the last moment. The night before the final signing, they cooked dinner, set the table, and acted as though nothing had happened. My daughter-in-law even smiled, asking about my health, pretending to care about details she hadn't noticed in years. My son poured me a glass of water and said, almost gently, "You don't have to go through with this tomorrow. We can fix things." It was clever in a way. They thought kindness would undo the months of bitterness. But kindness offered as a weapon is still manipulation. I sat at that table, watching them act like a family we had never been, and I felt the distance more clearly than ever. The next morning, I walked out of the villa with my bag packed. I didn't make a speech, didn't pause for reflection. The papers were signed by midday, the keys exchanged, and just like that, the house was no longer mine. When I unlocked the door to the penthouse later that evening, the city spread out before me like an unspoken promise. The air was different, lighter, cleaner, unburdened by old resentments. For the first time in years, I closed a door behind me and felt peace instead of tension. I stood by the wide window, watching headlights move along the roads below, and realized something simple but freeing. The villa had never been my prison. It had been my test. And now I had passed. The first night in the penthouse was quiet, almost too quiet. After years of hearing slammed doors, muffled arguments, and the low hum of tension in my own villa, the silence felt strange. I sat by the window, the city stretched wide beneath me, and I let myself breathe. Yet, even in that peace, I knew the story wasn't finished. People like my son and his wife don't let go easily. I didn't have to wait long. Within a week, the knock came at my door. My son stood there, his wife just behind him, both wearing forced smiles that couldn't hide the unease in their eyes. They hadn't come to welcome me into this new space. I could read the purpose before they spoke. We were in the neighborhood. My son began, voice strained. Thought we'd see how you're settling in. I let them in, mostly because I wanted to see how far they'd go. They walked through the apartment, glancing at the furniture, the view, the polished floors. My daughter-in-law gave a low whistle. You really upgraded, she said, her tone carrying both admiration and envy. We sat around the dining table and I waited. It didn't take long. My son cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Dad, things are tight. The bills, the mortgage, you know how it is. Maybe if you could help us out a little. Just until we're back on our feet. There it was. Not an apology, not a shred of reflection on what they had done. Just need, dressed up as casual conversation. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. When I needed respect, you were silent. When I needed kindness, you chose her words over mine. And now you stand here, asking for help. He flinched but didn't argue. My daughter-in-law jumped in, her voice sharp. You're being unfair. Families support each other. Isn't that what you taught him? I turned to her, steady. Support isn't the same as exploitation. What you wanted wasn't family, it was control. And I won't give you either. The air in the room thickened. My son lowered his eyes, tapping the table nervously. His wife stood, furious. You'll regret this, she hissed.
No, he replied calmly.
I've already lived my regret. I won't repeat it. They left without another word, the slam of the door echoing in the otherwise still apartment. For a long while after, I sat there, feeling both the sting of finality and the lightness of release. Later that night, I walked to the window again. The city lights blinked like distant stars, and for the first time in decades, I didn't feel weighed down by the obligations of a house that had turned into a battlefield. My life had narrowed to a single truth. Respect can't be demanded by blood. It must be earned through action. I chose to stand on my own. Not because I didn't love my family, but because love without respect isn't love at all. I've learned that the real weight of betrayal doesn't come from the shouting matches or the slammed doors. It comes from the quiet moments after, when you're left alone with the memory of what should have been love. But in those silences, I also found something I never expected. Strength. The kind that doesn't come from fighting louder, but from standing taller. For people like us, dignity isn't a gift someone can give or take away. It's a choice we make, even when it costs us everything. And if you think this story carried its own sting, you should hear what happened next, when another moment I thought would be about celebration turned into something else entirely. It started with a birthday, but it ended with a decision that shook the very foundation of who belonged in my home. If you're ready to step with me into that part of the journey, the next chapter is waiting for you.